The ring hit the table with a sound like a gunshot. Louisa Gentry did not flinch. She had been flinching for 3 years and she was done with it. She stood in the center of the Caldwell mercantile, her dark hair pinned beneath a dusty traveling hat, her green eyes holding a steadiness that surprised even her, and she looked at the ring on the table and felt something inside her chest go completely, mercifully quiet. "That is your answer," she said. Harlan Voss did not look surprised. He looked exactly the way he always looked, which was like a man who expected the world to rearrange itself around his convenience. He was tall and broad-shouldered and wore his money like armor, and he picked the ring up off the table with 2 fingers as if it were something mildly inconvenient rather than 3 years of her life compressed into a circle of gold. "You are making a mistake," he said. "I know you believe that." "Louisa." His voice dropped, and she recognized the register. It was the voice he used when he wanted her to feel small without the effort of raising his tone. "Everyone in Caldwell Creek knows you are mine. You came here on my word. You live in my town. You work in my store. What do you think happens to you when you walk out that door?" The mercantile was not empty. 3 women stood near the bolts of cloth. A man was examining harnesses near the back wall. 2 boys had stopped pretending to sweep. Every single person in that room had gone completely still, because they had all, in their various ways, been waiting for this. Louisa had seen it in their faces for months, the collective holding of breath that comes when a community watches a secret wound fester toward a breaking point. She thought about what happened next. She had been thinking about it for 6 months, ever since she had found the letter, since she had understood the shape of the trap Harlan Voss had been building around her from the very first day she had stepped off the stage from Missouri. She thought about her options with the kind of cold clarity that comes only to people who have nothing left to lose. Then the door opened, and Eli Carson walked in. He was not supposed to be there. He worked the Danner Ranch 12 miles south, and he came to town on Saturdays, and this was a Wednesday in October of 1878. He had come in for a bag of nails and a length of rope, and he had walked directly into the single most electrically charged moment Caldwell Creek had witnessed since the sheriff had been run out of town 2 summers prior. He stopped just inside the door, took in the room, took in Harlan Voss with his jaw set and his ring in his hand, took in Louisa Gentry standing at the center of it all with her chin up and her traveling bag at her feet. And then he did something that no one in Caldwell Creek, in all the months of watching and assuming, and deciding the shape of Louisa Gentry's life without consulting her, had ever thought to do. He looked at Louisa directly, quietly, without assumption, and he said, "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need any help?" The whole room seemed to exhale. Louisa Gentry looked at this quiet man she barely knew, this dark-haired cowboy who said perhaps 12 words in a sitting and always held the door and never once told her what she was or what she should be. And she felt the first thing close to hope she had felt since she had crossed the Missouri border into Kansas. "Yes," she said, "I think I do." That was how it started. But to understand how she arrived at that mercantile with her bag packed and a ring on the table, you have to go back to the spring of 1876, when Louisa Gentry was 22 years old and naive enough to think a letter from Kansas could mean a new beginning. She had grown up in St. Joseph, Missouri, in a household that was kind but poor in the complicated way that means there is always enough to eat but never enough to hope. Her father had been a school teacher who died of fever when she was 15, leaving her mother to take in sewing, and leaving Louisa to develop the particular self-sufficiency of a young woman who understands early that no one is coming to rescue her. She educated herself on her father's books. She helped her mother until her mother married again, and the new husband made it clear that grown daughters were furniture he had not ordered. And then she was 22 and reading a notice in the back of a newspaper about a businessman in Kansas who required a capable woman to help manage his mercantile. The notice was careful. It did not say wife. It said capable woman, good character, some education preferred, interested in the commercial life of a growing town. It was signed H. Voss, Caldwell Creek, Kansas. She wrote to him. He wrote back, and his letter was impressive in the way that only letters from men who know how to use words to build false rooms can be impressive. He spoke about the town, about the opportunities of the frontier, about a life with real purpose. He did not mention love. He did not mention marriage. He offered her a wage, passage, and the use of a room above the mercantile. She should have known later that no legitimate offer was that clean. But she was 22 and living in a house where she was surplus, and the frontier was still, in 1876, a word that meant possibility. Caldwell Creek was a cattle town on the edge of the Kansas plains, the kind of place that had sprung up around a water source and a railroad spur, and the particular energy of men who had come from somewhere worse. There were perhaps 400 people in the town proper, a church, a doctor, a saloon, a school with 8 students, and Voss's mercantile, which was the largest and best-stocked building on the main street, and which functioned as the commercial heart of the community in the way that only a store that extends credit during lean years can function. Harlan Voss was 38 when Louisa arrived, which was not an insurmountable age gap, but which became significant only in light of what the age difference actually meant in practice, which was that he had been building this town, and this life, and his hold over both, for long enough that everyone in Caldwell Creek owed him something. The banker was a cousin. The deputy was a man Voss had hired and paid for 2 years before the county took over his salary. The preacher had received a donation that kept the church roof from falling in during the winter of 1874. In this context, Louisa arrived and was immediately interpreted by the town. She was his. That was the shorthand. She had come on his word, she worked in his store, she lived in the room above it, and Harlan Voss was a man whose things stayed his. No one thought about the fact that she had signed a work agreement, not a marriage contract. No one thought about the fact that when Thomas Ellery from the hardware store had tried to invite her to the summer social, Harlan had appeared within the hour with a quiet word that had left Thomas pale and newly interested in his own business. No one thought about these things because Harlan Voss had built the town in his image, and in his image, the available woman who came at his word and worked in his store was his woman, full stop, and the town reflected that image back at him without question. Louisa noticed. She noticed in the way that a woman who has grown up having to pay close attention to the behavior of people with power over her always notices. She noticed the way invitations did not come, the way the women at the church were polite but careful, the way the men at the bar treated her like she was already someone's property and therefore invisible in a specific way. She filed these observations away and told herself it was the nature of a small town, and that Harlan had been respectful, and that the work was real work, and that she was building something. She told herself this for 8 months. Then she found the letter. She had been reorganizing the back room of the mercantile in February of 1878, sorting through a box of papers that had gotten wet in a leak and needed to be assessed for what could be salvaged. And she found, tucked inside a ledger from 1875, a letter from a man named Douglas Parrott in Abilene who appeared to be Harlan's lawyer. The letter was 2 years old. It was about property consolidation. It referred, in the dry language of legal correspondence, to the planned acquisition of the Gentry party upon her arrival, and discussed the mechanism by which a woman who arrived in a territory with no family and no independent means could be made, through a series of quiet legal maneuvers involving credit, residency, and a specific clause in the territory's homesteading addendum, to be financially bound to the man who had sponsored her passage. Louisa sat on the floor of the back room with that letter in her hands for a long time. The trap had been the entire thing, not just the job offer, not just the room above the store. The trap was the design, the architecture of her situation here, the reason no one had ever quite invited her anywhere or treated her like she was truly free to make her own choices. Harlan Voss had not brought her to Caldwell Creek because he needed a capable woman to help manage his mercantile. He had brought her because he had found a legal mechanism to acquire her, and her labor, and her presence in his life, with the same cold efficiency with which he acquired land and credit agreements. She put the letter back in the ledger. She put the ledger in the pile to be burned. She went back to the front of the store and she measured out 3 yards of calico for Mrs. Hennessy, and she did not let anything show in her face. She spent the next 8 months being very, very careful. She worked. She smiled. She was pleasant to Harlan and distant in the way that had always worked between them, the formal cordiality of employer and employee that he had never pushed past because he was a patient man and a strategic one, and because the legal mechanism was moving slowly and he was in no rush. She saved every cent of her wages in a small tin she kept in the bottom of her boot bag. She read every document she was asked to sign with the attention of someone who had finally understood the shape of the room she was in, and she made a plan. The plan was simple. She needed enough money for a stage ticket to Wichita, and a letter of reference she could write herself on the mercantile letterhead, which she could do because she knew where the letterhead was kept, and she had been writing Harlan's correspondence for 2 years. She needed to get out before the legal mechanism finished assembling itself, which the letter had indicated would require 3 years of continuous residency, and her 3 years were up in October 1878. The same month she had put the ring on the table, because that was the other thing she had not planned on, the thing that had complicated the architecture of her exit. In September of 1878, Harlan Voss had apparently decided that the legal mechanism was almost complete and that he was tired of waiting, and he had given her a ring and told her they would be married at Christmas. And the way he said it made it clear that this was not a proposal so much as a notification. And the town, when word got around, had nodded and said yes, of course. They had all known it was coming. She had taken the ring that day and said she needed time to think, which had bought her 3 weeks, which she had used to get the money and the letter and the plan to a place where she could execute it. And then it had been a Wednesday in October of 1878, and she had packed her bag and walked into the mercantile with the ring and her heart hammering so hard she could hear it, and she had put the ring on the table. And then Eli Carson had walked in. Eli Carson had come to Caldwell Creek in the spring of 1877, which meant he had been there for a year and a half by the time the ring hit the table, which was long enough for the town to know him, but not long enough for the town to feel it had a claim on him. He worked for Charles Danner, who ran the largest cattle operation south of town, and he was good at his work in the quiet, consistent way that distinguished men who actually knew cattle from men who merely performed the knowledge of cattle. He rode clean, kept his own counsel, and had a reputation for reliability that was the most valuable currency on the frontier. He was 28. He was not tall in the showy way, but he had the kind of presence that came from a man who was entirely comfortable with exactly the amount of space he took up, no more, no less. He had dark hair that was always slightly too long because he forgot to cut it, and dark eyes that were attentive in a way that most people missed because they mistook his quietness for inattention. His hands were the hands of a working man, scarred and capable, and he had a way of listening that Louisa had noticed in the mercantile the few times they had done business, a quality of actual attention that she had learned, in a life among men who spoke over and around women, to value enormously. He had come in for nails and rope. He had walked into a room full of held breath and found Louisa Gentry standing at the edge of her own life with a packed bag, and he had asked if she needed help. Harlan Voss looked at him the way he looked at everything that threatened his arrangements. "Carson," he said, "this is not your business." Eli looked at Louisa, not at Harlan, at Louisa. "Ma'am," he said. "I am leaving," Louisa said. "I have my wages owed through today calculated, and I would like them now, and then I am going to take the stage to Wichita." "The stage does not come until Friday," Harlan said, and there was something in his voice that was close to satisfaction. "I know," Louisa said. "I will wait." "You will wait here," Harlan said, "in my store, in my town." The room was very quiet. The woman near the bolts of cloth had stopped pretending to look at them entirely. The man by the harnesses had gone still as a fence post. Eli Carson set his bag of nails down on the counter with a small, deliberate sound, and he turned to face Harlan Voss with the kind of steadiness that has nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with a man who has decided something. "Mr. Voss," he said, "the lady says she is leaving. I do not believe she requires your permission for that." He looked at Louisa again. "I have a wagon outside. I can take you to the Danner Ranch if you need somewhere to stay until Friday. Mrs. Danner would be glad to have a guest." The Danner Ranch was 12 miles south and the most respectable address in the county outside of town, and everyone in that room knew it. And everyone in that room also understood the shift that had just occurred, which was that Eli Carson had inserted himself between Louisa Gentry and the machinery that had been running her life for 3 years and offered her a door out of it, and the question was whether she would take it. She looked at Harlan Voss one last time. He was holding the ring. His jaw was very tight, and she could see the calculation in his eyes, the assessment of whether he could stop her here in public with a witness, and she watched him decide that he could not today, not without exposing more than he wanted exposed. "My wages," she said. He opened the register. He counted out what she was owed with the precise and furious efficiency of a man who had lost a game he did not know he was playing, and he set it on the counter and said nothing. She took it. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door where Eli Carson was holding it open, and she walked through it. And the air outside was clean and cold with the first edge of October autumn, and she breathed it in like something she had been saving for years. The wagon was a working ranch wagon, plain wood, with a canvas tarp folded in the back over a toolbox. Eli put her bag in the back and helped her up onto the seat without comment, and then he climbed up beside her and shook the reins, and they moved down the main street of Caldwell Creek, with the entire town watching from windows and doorways, and Louisa sat very straight and did not look back. They were a mile out of town before either of them spoke. "Thank you," she said. "You would have managed," he said. She thought about that. "Yes," she said, "but I am glad I did not have to." He nodded. He kept his eyes on the road. The prairie rolled out around them in every direction, brown and gold with autumn, the grass moving in long, slow waves under a sky so enormous it always made her feel both terrified and free. She had hated that sky when she arrived. She had been thinking recently that she might miss it. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Wichita first," she said. "Then I do not know, there is more world after Wichita." He was quiet for a long moment. "There is," he agreed. They drove the 12 miles south in a conversation that was made as much of silence as of words, but it was not the heavy silence of strangers with nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who had each spent considerable time learning that silence was often preferable to noise, and who recognized that quality in each other without needing to discuss it. She told him, in pieces, about the letter she had found, about the trap she had been living inside without knowing its full dimensions. He listened without interrupting. He asked one question. "Did you keep the letter?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "I burned it with the rest of that box." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a shame," he said. "Not for you, but it might have been useful later if Voss causes more trouble." She had not thought about later in terms of trouble. She had been focused entirely on the now of escape. She considered what he was saying, the dark past of Harlan Voss's maneuvers, the possibility that the legal mechanism she had read about might still be set in motion even after she left, that simply removing herself from Caldwell Creek might not be sufficient to fully disentangle herself from the trap. "You know something about the law," she said. "I know enough," he said. "My father was a lawyer in Tennessee before the war changed everything." She looked at his profile. There was a whole story in that single sentence, the kind of story that the frontier was full of, people who had been something else somewhere else before the war or the drought or the debt or the grief had rearranged them. "What brought you out here?" she asked. "The same thing that brings most people," he said. "The belief that out here you can become what you decide to be instead of what you were born into." "Has that been true?" she asked. He turned and looked at her then, directly and quietly, and she felt the weight of his attention like something warm. "Getting truer every day," he said. Adelaide Danner was a brisk, capable woman of 50 who had been running the ranch with her husband Charles for 22 years, and who took one look at Louisa Gentry climbing down from Eli's wagon and said, "Come inside, child. You look like you have been carrying something extremely heavy," and put a cup of coffee in her hands before any introductions were made. Charles Danner was not particularly surprised to see Eli bring a guest. He was a man of 60 who had watched the territory grow up around him, and had developed a corresponding calm about most developments. He shook Louisa's hand and said Eli's judgment was good enough for him, and that she was welcome to stay until the Friday stage. The Danner Ranch was a working ranch, not a grand one, but it was solid and warm and full of the particular ordered chaos of a place that was a real home rather than a performance of one. There were ranch hands who ate supper at a long table in the main room, and there was a dog of indeterminate heritage who had strong opinions about where people sat, and there was a fire in the hearth and the smell of beans and cornbread, and Louisa sat in the middle of all of it on that Wednesday evening and felt something in her chest begin, very carefully, to unknot. She sat next to Eli at supper. He introduced her simply as a woman he had given a ride to, and the ranch hands accepted this with the lack of curiosity that characterized men who had enough real business to attend to without manufacturing drama. After supper, most of them drifted out to the bunkhouse, and Adelaide declared she was going to bed because she had been up since 4, and Charles said he had accounts to review, and in the process of all this ordinary evening dispersal, Louisa found herself sitting by the fire with Eli Carson and a dog named General who had decided she was acceptable and put his head in her lap. "He does not do that with everyone," Eli said. "He seems like a good judge of character," Louisa said, and scratched General's ears, and Eli smiled in the quiet way he had, more in his eyes than on his face, and she felt it like a small, warm ember. "What will you do in Wichita?" he asked. "Find work," she said. "I have managed accounts and inventory and correspondence for 2 years. Someone will need that." "They will," he agreed. "I am trying not to think past that," she admitted. "I spent a lot of the last 8 months thinking only as far as getting out. Past the exit feels large." "That is reasonable," he said. "The exit was the urgent thing." She looked at the fire. "I keep thinking about what you said," she said. "About becoming what you decide to be instead of what you were born into. I have been that here. The woman Harlan Voss decided I was before I ever arrived. I want to be something I decided." He was quiet for a moment, watching the fire alongside her. "What would you decide?" he asked. No one had ever asked her that. Not in that way, not as a real question with a space after it for a real answer. She thought about it with the unfamiliar luxury of being actually asked. "I think I want to have a place," she said slowly. "A real place that is mine, where I do the accounts because I am the owner and not because someone is building a legal case around my labor. I want to read books and argue about ideas and see what the country looks like past the Kansas plains." She paused. "That is probably very ordinary." "None of that is ordinary," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, and she could see the side of his face, the line of his jaw, the way his hands rested on his knees, still and easy. "What do you want?" she asked. He took a slow breath. "Something real," he said. "Something that is mine and stays mine and is built on truth instead of performance." She understood that with a clarity that surprised her. "The performance," she said. "Everything out here is performance, half of it," he said. "The toughest man in the saloon, the most successful rancher, the most respectable businessman. I am tired of performing." He looked at her. "You were not performing in that store today." "No," she said. "I was terrified. That was not what it looked like." She laughed slightly, the first genuine laugh she had produced in longer than she could quite remember. "What did it look like?" "It looked like someone who had made up their mind," he said, and the way he said it, quietly and with certainty, made it feel like the finest compliment she had ever received. She slept that night in a small, clean room at the back of the Danner house, and she slept better than she had in 8 months, which surprised her because she was 2 days from a stage ride into an uncertain future. When she thought about it later, she decided the quality of the sleep had something to do with the specific texture of the evening she had just spent. The fire and the dog and the quiet man who asked real questions and waited for real answers, and the feeling of having, for the first time in 3 years, been permitted to simply be herself without the overlay of someone else's plan for her. Thursday was a working day on the ranch, and she spent it usefully, helping Adelaide in the kitchen and doing a bit of mending she offered because sitting idle made her restless, and Adelaide accepted without fuss because Adelaide herself was incapable of sitting idle. They talked easily, the way women do when they are both doing something with their hands and the pressure of performance is removed. Adelaide told her about the ranch, about the early years, about burying a child in 1861, and building something real afterward because grief either stops you or strips away everything that was not essential, and she had chosen the latter. Louisa told her about St. Joseph and her father and the books and Harlan Voss and the letter in the ledger. Adelaide listened without interrupting, and when Louisa finished she said, "That man has been doing this kind of thing for 20 years and no one has ever called him on it because he was always careful to do it to women who had no one to call it for them." She paused. "Until today. I called it on myself," Louisa said. "You did," Adelaide said, "but it helped to have a door." She looked at Louisa with the particular direct attention of a woman who had been watching human beings navigate the frontier for a long time. "Eli is a good man," she said, not as a suggestion. As a statement of fact in a conversation that had not been about Eli, Louisa looked at the mending in her hands. "He is," she said. "He has not looked at anyone since he came here," Adelaide said, returning to her work. "Which is interesting because he has had plenty of opportunity, but he is particular." She said this without further elaboration, and Louisa, who had been trained by 3 years of living in Harlan Voss's orbit to hear the shape of what was not being said, understood perfectly well. The afternoon was clear and cold, and she walked out to look at the horses because she had always liked horses better than she let on. And Eli was there working with a young gelding that was being introduced to a saddle for the first time, moving around the animal with a patience that was beautiful to watch, the quality of his attention entirely on the horse, nothing performed, nothing rushed. She leaned on the fence and watched. He knew she was there, she could tell by a slight adjustment in his posture, but he did not break his focus or make a show of not looking at her, which was its own kind of attention. The kind that says, "I know you are there, and I am glad, and I will be with you when I am done." And she found it more moving than any amount of immediate ardent focus would have been. When the horse was settled and he came to the fence, he was dusty and comfortable in the way of a man doing the work he was built for. And she thought, looking at him, about the dark past he had mentioned, the father who was a lawyer before the war changed everything. And she realized she did not know what had brought him specifically to this ranch in this county. And she also realized she wanted to know, which was a different feeling from wanting to know as a matter of caution or self-preservation. Which was how she had learned to gather information about people. She wanted to know because she was genuinely interested in who he was. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "What happened with your family after the war?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the horses in the pasture. "My father died in 63, he said. "Chickamauga. My mother held on for 2 years after, and then she was done holding on and she died in 65, which I think was her choice even if it did not look like one." He paused. "I had 2 brothers. One died in the war on the other side of the same battle, which is a thing I have never fully understood how to hold. The other went west in 66 and wrote twice and then stopped writing." "So you came west to find him?" Louisa asked. "I came west because there was nothing left to stay for," he said. "But yes, partly to look." He paused. "I found him in 69 in Nevada. He had a claim and a woman he had not married and a sickness I think he had always had but that the war had made impossible to ignore, and he died in 71. He said this with the quiet finality of someone who has arrived at the other side of grief and no longer needs to perform it. After that I was just West. And now, she asked. He looked at her. Now I am here, he said, and it is the first time in a long time that here feels like somewhere I chose. She held that carefully. I have to go to Wichita on Friday, she said. I know, he said. They stood at the fence in the cooling afternoon, with the horses moving peacefully in the pasture, and the sky going rose and gold above the Kansas plains, and neither of them said anything else, because there was something forming between them that neither of them wanted to rush, and they were both people who had learned that rushing toward things was often a way of missing them. Friday morning came with frost on the grass and a pewter sky, and the practical reality that Louisa needed to be at the stage stop in Caldwell Creek by 10. Charles Danner said the wagon was ready when she was. Eli was there when she came out with her bag, and he helped her up without asking, which she liked. Adelaide handed her a wrapped parcel at the door. Something for the ride, she said, and this. She pressed a folded piece of paper into Louisa's hand. My sister is in Wichita. She runs a boarding house on 4th Street. Tell her I sent you. She will give you fair rates and good company. Louisa held the paper and felt the sudden, sharp, unexpected sensation of being cared for without condition, which was foreign enough to her recent experience that it made her eyes sting. Thank you, she said. Adelaide looked at her with warmth and practicality in equal measure. You will be all right, she said, not as reassurance. As prediction, Charles rode with them. He had business in town anyway, and Eli had his own errand, the nails and rope he had never gotten on Wednesday. The ride to town was pleasant in the way that had a slight current of something under it, the awareness that when they arrived at the stage stop the forward motion she had been building for 8 months would carry her past the limits of Caldwell Creek and into the next part of her life, which had not yet taken shape. She was not afraid. That surprised her. She had been afraid for so long that the absence of it felt almost structural, like a load-bearing wall removed to find the building still standing. They came into Caldwell Creek from the south end of Main Street, and she could see the stage stop at the north end, and she could also see, halfway up the street, Harlan Voss standing in front of his mercantile with the deputy beside him, and her chest tightened. The deputy was a man named Ruck Holloway who owed Harlan 3 years of loyalty and several personal favors, and who was not a man of bad character so much as a man of flexible character, which in practice amounted to the same thing when the man he owed loyalty to decided he needed something from the law's direction. Eli slowed the wagon without being asked. He had seen them too. It is probably nothing, Charles said from behind them, but his tone said he was not convinced. It was not nothing. Ruck Holloway walked into the street as they drew closer, and he held up a hand with the particular authority of a man who is using his position to do a personal favor and hoping no one looks too closely at the paperwork. Miss Gentry, he said, I am going to need you to step down for a moment. There is a matter of a debt. Louisa's blood went cold, not with fear, with a kind of furious recognition. What debt? She said. Room and board, Holloway said. 3 years unpaid. Mr. Voss has filed a claim with the circuit court. He held up a paper. You cannot leave the county while it is pending. She looked at Harlan Voss standing in front of his store. He was watching with the satisfaction of a man who has played his trump card and knows it. This was the legal mechanism. This was what the letter had described. Not a marriage contract, not an overt claim of ownership, but the slow grind of debt law, the assertion that the room above the store, which she had been told was part of her wage arrangement, had in fact been a running debt, and that the debt now needed to be settled before she could leave. In 1878 in Kansas, a debt claim filed with the circuit court could hold a person in a county for weeks while the matter was reviewed. Weeks in which Harlan Voss would have ample time to complete whatever other arrangements he had in progress. Eli was very still on the seat beside her. "How much?" he said quietly, not to her. Holloway blinked. He had not expected that question. "I beg your pardon. How much is the debt?" Eli said. "The claimed amount. How much is he saying she owes?" Holloway looked at his paper. He named a figure that was very precisely calculated to be just large enough to be unmanageable for a woman who had saved her wages over 8 months, but had been earning only a modest rate. Eli looked at the figure. He looked at Charles Danner. Something passed between them that was the currency of men who have known each other a long time and trust each other's judgment. Then Eli reached into his coat and produced a small leather wallet. He counted out the amount in paper currency and coin, and handed it to Holloway with a calmness that was more unsettling than anger would have been. "There is the debt settled," he said. "Receipt, please." Holloway stood with the money in his hands, looking like a man who had not thought past the moment of interception. "Now," Eli said, still quiet, still even if Mr. Voss files another claim, I will need you to note the time and the amount, because we will be recording the pattern of litigation against a citizen who is attempting to leave freely, and I expect the circuit judge will find that pattern interesting. He had his father's legal instincts. Louisa could see it clearly, the architecture of how he had just built a wall between her and the trap, using the same tools the trap was built from. Harlan Voss was still standing in front of his store. He was not satisfied anymore. He was calculating. She could see it from 40 feet away, the rapid reassessment of a man who has had his strategy outmaneuvered and is deciding whether the next move is worth the exposure. She turned in her seat and looked at him, and she let him see her face clearly, the absence of fear, the fullness of understanding, the complete clarity about who he was and what he had tried to do, and she let that be the last thing between them. He went back inside his store. Holloway gave Eli a receipt. He walked away with his posture suggesting a man who had just reassessed certain of his professional associations. Charles Danner made a sound that might have been satisfaction. They drove to the stage stop without further incident. The stage was loading. There were 2 other passengers, a commercial traveler with a sample case and an elderly woman visiting family. The driver was checking the harness with the habitual thoroughness of a man who has been depending on harnesses for his life for many years. Eli helped her down from the wagon and brought her bag. Charles said he would collect the things he needed and meet Eli at the general store, and went off with the tact of a man who understood when to make himself scarce. Louisa stood by the stage with her bag in her hand and looked at Eli Carson in the pale October morning. He had just paid a fraudulent debt out of his own pocket to give her freedom she had already earned. He had walked into a charged room on a Wednesday and asked if she needed help, not because he was told to and not because he wanted anything from it, but because it was the right question and he was the kind of man who asked the right question. "You paid that debt," she said. "I did." "I will pay you back," she said. "I know you will," he said. "When you can." He paused. "There is no hurry." She looked at him. "Why?" she asked. Not the specific why, but the larger one, the one that held everything from the mercantile to this moment. He held her gaze. "Because everyone in this county decided what you were without asking you," he said. And that seemed like something that needed correcting. She felt her throat tight. Most people did not think it was their business to correct it. "Most people are not in the habit of asking what they should be doing," he said, and then, quietly, without theater or pressure, "I would like to write to you, if you are willing, to know you got there safely and after that to know how you are doing." She had not expected that. She had been holding herself very carefully in the shape of a woman who was going to leave and not look back, and the offer of a letter had made that shape complicated in a way she had not anticipated. "I would like that," she said. The stage driver called the boarding. She picked up her bag. She looked at him one more time. She thought of the fire in general, the dog, and the question he had asked about what she wanted, and the way he had listened to the answer. "Eli," she said. "Louisa," he said. Just her name, the first time he had used it, and the way he said it was quiet and certain and held her whole, and she felt it land somewhere deep in her chest and stay there. She got on the stage. She did not look out the window as it pulled away because she thought if she did she might do something impractical. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked forward and thought about Wichita, and about Adelaide's sister on 4th Street, and about letters. Wichita in the fall of 1878 was a city in transition. The cattle drives that had made it wild and famous were thinning as the railroads pushed south, and the town was beginning to acquire the civic ambition of a place that wanted to be taken seriously. Wide streets and brick buildings going up alongside the original wood structures, churches and schools, and a newspaper that published 4 days a week. Louisa found Adelaide's sister, whose name was Ruth Kavanaugh, exactly where Adelaide had said, on 4th Street in a clean boarding house with yellow curtains and a rule about no tobacco inside the rooms. Ruth looked at Adelaide's note and gave Louisa a room on the 2nd floor and a reasonable rate, and the name of the city's largest commercial concern, a wholesale dry goods operation that was looking for a bookkeeper. Louisa walked in the next morning with her 2 years of mercantile experience and her natural composure and her father's education, and was hired before noon by a man named Garrett who was less interested in her personal history than in whether she could maintain a double entry ledger and write a clear business letter, and who seemed entirely unconcerned with the question of who had claim on her, as if that were not a relevant consideration, which was a revelation in itself. She began to build a life in the new shapes, cautiously and then with increasing confidence, like someone testing ice that turns out to hold weight. She wrote to Adelaide to say she had arrived safely and found work and was grateful. She wrote to Eli. His first letter arrived 3 weeks later, and it was what she would have predicted if she had thought about it, which was that it was exactly as long as it needed to be and not a word longer, and that it was honest in the particular way of someone who had decided not to perform. He told her about a heifer that had gotten herself stuck in a gully and the 3 hours it had taken to extract her. He told her that Charles had heard from the circuit court in Caldwell Creek that Harlan Voss had withdrawn his debt claim, which meant the threat was officially gone. He said the weather had turned cold and the prairie looked like a bruise at sunset, which she found to be an unexpectedly precise description. She wrote back and told him about the bookkeeping and Ruth Kavanaugh, and a book she had found in a shop on Main Street that was about the geologic history of the West, which she had found, to her surprise, to be genuinely compelling. She told him she had walked along the river at dusk and the light had been remarkable. The letters continued. They became, over the weeks that followed, the thing she looked forward to most consistently. There was something in the exchange that had the same quality as that first evening by the fire, the two of them not performing, not constructing, just being exactly what they were, and finding that what they were fit together with a naturalness that she turned over in her mind frequently in the way you do with something you are not entirely sure you trust, because it does not match your prior experience of how good things are distributed. She had not expected to trust easily again after Caldwell Creek. She had expected to be cautious, which was reasonable, and possibly guarded for a long time, which was also reasonable given the specific shape of the betrayal she had survived. But there was something about Eli's letters and about the way she had seen him behave under pressure that made the caution feel less necessary. He had not performed heroism. He had performed the simple act of asking and then following through. That was all. It was not complicated. It was, as far as she could tell, just who he was. By December she had enough in savings to pay him back the debt money. She sent it with the next letter and said thank you again for the freedom. His response arrived in January of 1879, and it said that he had deposited the money in the bank and that he wanted to tell her something directly, which was that writing to her was the best part of his weeks, and that he would like, if she was willing, to come to Wichita in the spring when the cattle situation settled enough for him to take time away, not for any presumptuous purpose, but simply because he would like to see her and talk to her in the same air instead of across paper. She read that letter at Ruth's kitchen table with her morning coffee going cold and her heart doing something it had not been doing in years, which was the thing that happens when something you have been carefully not hoping for becomes a real possibility. She wrote back and said yes, she would like that very much. He came to Wichita in April of 1879 on the train from Caldwell Creek, which was fast enough to be a day's journey, and which arrived at the Wichita station at 3 in the afternoon on a clear spring day. She met him there because it seemed easier than directing him through the streets, and she saw him step off the train onto the platform, and the 6 months of letters collapsed down into the simple real fact of him standing there with his hat in his hand, slightly taller than she remembered, or maybe she had remembered him wrong, and the particular quality of his attention focused immediately on her across 20 feet of crowded platform. She walked toward him and he walked toward her, and they met in the middle, and he said, "Hello, Louisa," and she said, "Hello, Eli," and there was a moment of standing close enough to be real people to each other again that was quiet and full and complete in itself. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. "Come on, I will show you the city." They spent the afternoon walking. She showed him the river and the newspaper office and the dry goods building where she worked and the book shop where she had found the geology book, and he looked at all of it with his quiet, genuine attention and asked real questions, and she realized she was happy in the specific and clean sense of the word, not performing happiness or working toward it, but just having it, walking beside this man in the spring afternoon. They had supper at a restaurant on Douglas Avenue, the kind of place that had cloth napkins and real silverware, which felt like a small celebration of the distance she had traveled from the room above a mercantile in Caldwell Creek. The conversation was exactly like the letters, which was to say it was easy and real and ranged across a wide territory of topics, cattle and history and books, and the question of what the frontier would look like in 20 years. And she found herself thinking that she had never had a conversation like this with a man before, which was a remarkable thought to have in a restaurant on Douglas Avenue with a fork halfway to your mouth. After supper they sat in the small parlor of Ruth's boarding house, which Ruth made available with her characteristic tact, and they talked for another 2 hours, and at some point the conversation shifted from the wide to the specific, from the world to themselves, and it was Eli who made that shift in his direct and quiet way. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I have not got much talent for saying important things indirectly." "Say it," she said. "I think about you constantly," he said. "Not in a constructed way, I just do, and I want to know if you think about me." She looked at him across the small space of the parlor, the lamp burning between them, the sounds of the street outside. She thought about all the ways she had learned to be careful, and she thought about the fact that this was not a man who built traps. "Yes," she said, "I think about you all the time." The simplicity of the exchange had a weight and a quality that elaborate declarations would not have had, and they sat with it for a moment in the way of two people who have both been given something they did not entirely know how to hold, but intended to hold carefully. "I want to ask you something," he said, and there was a quality in how he said it that made her understand this was the asking, the real asking that the entire 6 months had been building toward. "Then ask," she said. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to come to Wichita and take you to supper and write you letters and come back again, and I want to do that honestly and with your full knowledge that what I am working toward is a life with you, if you will have that. Not because I need a capable woman or because I have a legal mechanism. Because I want you specifically and I think you are remarkable and I want to build something real with a person who is also trying to build something real." She took a breath. Outside the window a horse went by on the street and someone laughed somewhere in the building, and the lamp on the table between them burned steadily. "Yes," she said, "I will have that." He smiled then, the full version, not just in his eyes but all the way across his face, and it changed his face in a way that made her want to keep causing it. He stayed in Wichita for 4 days. They were the best 4 days she could recently remember. They walked and talked and went to a lecture at the church hall about the history of the territory given by a professor from the East who was on a speaking tour, and they argued amiably about one of his points afterward over coffee, and she discovered that Eli, in an argument about ideas, was exactly as he was in all other contexts, which was attentive and fair and comfortable with being wrong when he was wrong, which she found to be an extraordinary quality in a person. He left on the train on a Thursday morning, and she stood on the platform, and he held both her hands for a moment before he boarded and looked at her with that particular direct, quiet gaze and said, "I will write you tomorrow." "You had better," she said. He did write her the next day. He wrote her every few days after that, and he came back in June, and again in August, and by August the shape of things between them had become clear enough and close enough that they spent an afternoon walking along the river talking about what a life together might look like and where and how. And these were not abstract conversations but practical ones, the kind that involve questions about land and money, and what each person wanted from the days that added up to a life. She had grown attached to Wichita. She had built a real thing here, the job and the independence and the life she had constructed on her own terms, and she was honest with him about the fact that leaving it would require genuine thought. "I am not asking you to leave it," he said. "I am asking what you want. We have options." "Tell me what you have been thinking," she said. He told her. He had been putting money aside for 2 years, not specifically for this, but for the general direction of having something of his own. He had been watching a piece of land north of Caldwell Creek that had come available, good land, well watered, manageable for a man who knew cattle and who had a partner willing to take on the accounts and the correspondence end of things, which in his estimation was the difference between a ranch that barely got by and one that actually prospered. He said he had been thinking about a small operation to start, maybe 400 acres, growing over time. He said this in a practical voice, and then he looked at her and said, "But I would want to know what you want it to look like, because it would be yours equally." The land north of Caldwell Creek meant being in the same county as Harlan Voss. She said so. "Voss withdrew his claim," Eli said. "He has been careful since then. I think he knew he overreached." He paused. "But that is a real concern, and if it is one you cannot be comfortable with, there is other land in other places." She thought about Harlan Voss. She thought about the ring on the table and the way she had felt in the mercantile. Not only the fear, but underneath it the bedrock of who she was that no one's trap could actually remove. She thought about how far she had come from that room above the store, and how little power Harlan Voss actually had over the woman she had become since October. "Let me see the land," she said. He brought her to see the land in September of 1879. They rode out to it on a bright fall morning, the air clean and cold, the grass gone to its autumn gold, and the land was everything he had said. A wide, gentle slope above a reliable creek with good grass, and a stand of cottonwoods to the east, and enough sky above it to make you feel like the world was larger than you had remembered. She stood in the middle of it and turned slowly and felt something settle in her that had been in motion for a long time. "Yes," she said. He was standing a few feet away watching her with a quiet that held a great deal of feeling in it. "Yes to the land," he said, "or yes to the whole of it." She turned and faced him with the autumn light around her, and the full knowledge of who she was and who he was, and what they had built together in the year since a Wednesday in October in a mercantile, and she smiled. "Yes to the whole of it," she said. They were married in November of 1879 in Wichita, in the church on Douglas Avenue, with Ruth Cavanaugh and Adelaide and Charles Danner, and a handful of Eli's friends from the ranch as witnesses. It was not a large wedding. Both of them had preferred the small and genuine to the large and performed for their entire lives, and their wedding reflected this. A simple ceremony, and then a dinner at the restaurant on Douglas Avenue with the people who mattered. Louisa wore a dress she had made herself from cloth she had chosen, deep green wool with cream collar and cuffs, and she walked into the church on her own arm because she had no one to give her away and felt no absence in this, only the clean fact of herself choosing freely. Eli stood at the front of the church with the look of a man who had arrived at the exact place he meant to be, and when she reached him and they stood face to face, The ceremony that followed felt less like a transformation and more like a formalization, a public declaration of a thing that had been true in its essential nature for quite some time. The minister asked if she took Eli Carson as her husband. She looked at Eli's face and felt the full weight of the question, not as a performance but as a real thing, and said yes with a certainty that settled somewhere in the room like a change in light. They went north to the land in December, moving into a small house that had been built in haste, but that would be added to over time. A single main room and a kitchen and a bedroom, plain and solid, smelling of new wood and the cold outside, and the particular potential of a place that has not yet become itself. She stood in the kitchen of her own house on the first morning and made coffee on her own stove, and felt the word mind settle quietly over everything she could see: the stove, the window, the cold light coming in from the north, the sound of Eli outside checking on the horses, and the feeling was not the grasping possessive quality of mind that she had seen in Harlan Voss, but the warm-rooted quality of belonging and being belonged to by a place and a person freely. The first winter was hard. The frontier winter always was, and they were learning a new operation, a new piece of land, a new rhythm of two people living in close quarters who had previously lived alone. There were adjustments. She had habits he did not, and he had habits she did not, and there were evenings of friction that required the specific skill of people who had both decided this was worth the work of getting right. They were honest with each other in these moments in the way they had been honest in the letters, directly and without performance, which made the friction shorter and less damaging than it might otherwise have been. She set up the accounts in January, proper double entry ledgers, correspondence files, a system for tracking costs and income and the shape of what they were building. Eli looked at the system and said it was better than anything the Danner Ranch had ever used, and he was not wrong. And Charles Danner, when he came out to visit in February, said he might need to borrow her for a few weeks to sort out his own situation, which was the first indication that the competence Louisa had been developing quietly for several years had a market value beyond the particular enterprise she was applying it to. The cattle operation began in earnest in the spring. Eli bought the first stock with a care and patience that she recognized as characteristic, spending 3 weeks on research and reconnaissance before committing to anything, consulting with men he trusted, assessing the quality of what was available with the attention of someone who was building for the long term. She went with him on some of these trips because she was interested, and because she had learned, in Caldwell Creek, the cost of not understanding the financial structure of the operation you were living inside. The spring was long and full of work. She found that she liked ranching in the way she had not expected, the physical reality of it, the weather and the animals, and the rhythm of days governed by what needed doing rather than a clock or someone else's schedule. She found that she had opinions about cattle that she had not known she had, and that Eli listened to them and factored them into decisions with the same naturalness with which he did everything. And she found that being listened to by someone she respected was a pleasure she had underestimated. They hired their first hand in June, a young man named Pete Holbrook who was 19 and eager and had grown up on a ranch in Texas and knew more about cattle than she had at 19, but considerably less about accounting, which she found balanced out acceptably. Pete was cheerful and earnest and treated her with the easy respect of someone for whom a capable woman running the business end of a ranch operation was simply the fact of the situation, which she attributed partly to his youth and partly to the particular culture Eli maintained, which was one in which everyone's work was valued by its quality and not its source. The summer went. The operation grew. They were not rich and would not be for some years, but they were profitable in the modest and genuine way that matters, the way that is building something rather than only sustaining it. She wrote to Ruth in Wichita and to Adelaide and to her old employer Garrett, who had given her an excellent character reference when she left and who remained a professional contact worth keeping. She read her books in the evenings and argued with Eli about history and geography and the occasional article in the newspaper that arrived from Wichita twice a week. And she thought frequently, with a gratitude that did not diminish, about the specific texture of this life she had built compared to the texture of the one she had escaped from. In the fall of 1880, she told Eli she was expecting. He was in the kitchen when she told him, sitting at the table with the coffee she had not yet poured, and she came and sat across from him and said it directly because that was how she said important things, and watched his face do something it had not done before, which was break open into a joy so unguarded and complete that she felt it like a physical warmth. He reached across the table and took both her hands and said, "Louisa," and in the single syllable of her name was everything she needed to hear. The pregnancy was healthy. She kept the accounts and wrote out less as the winter deepened but stayed active, because she was a practical woman and not inclined toward the Victorian convention of treating pregnancy as a kind of invalidism. Adelaide came in January to help prepare, and her presence was the particular kind of help that comes from someone who has been through things and come out the other side and knows what matters and what does not. Their son was born in February of 1881, a solid, red-faced boy who arrived during a snowstorm with Adelaide in attendance, and Eli pacing outside the door with the controlled anxiety of a man who is very good at staying calm under practical pressure, but has no applicable skill set for the particular helplessness of waiting. She named him James, after her father. Eli did not argue about the name because he understood it, and also because he liked it. James Henry Carson, the Henry being for Eli's father, the lawyer from Tennessee, and the combination felt like the right honoring of the people who had made them, the ones who had given them the foundation, even when the foundation was full of loss. James was a handsome boy who looked like neither of them specifically and both of them generally, and who was from very early on possessed of an extremely firm will and an equally firm good humor, a combination Louisa attributed to his father's temperament, and which Eli attributed to his mother's, and which was probably simply the boy himself. The ranch grew in the years that followed. They added a second pasture in 1882 and hired 2 more hands and added a room to the house, and Louisa expanded her bookkeeping work to include 3 neighboring ranches that hired her on a consulting basis, riding out to them once a month to review their ledgers and write their business correspondence, which gave her an independence of income she valued fiercely. Eli understood this and never suggested she did not need the income, or that her work was supplementary to the real work of the ranch, because he was not that kind of man, and because the partnership they had built was structured on the understanding that both of them were full contributors to the whole of it. She was 28 in 1882, which meant she had been on the frontier for 6 years, and had lived through enough of its texture to understand that it was not the romantic wilderness of popular imagination, but also not the brutal impossibility of its detractors. It was simply a hard and vivid place, where the things you built with your hands and your judgment were real, in a way she had not experienced in the insulated polite poverty of St. Joseph. She thought sometimes about her mother, who had remarried into a life that required her to make herself small, and about the version of herself that might have stayed in Missouri and contracted into the space available to her, and she felt the specific gratitude of a person who found the door before the room became permanent. Harlan Voss remained in Caldwell Creek. She saw him occasionally when business required her to go to town, and there was a period in 1881 when she had been quietly tense about those visits, old reflex more than real fear. But by 1882, he was simply a man she passed on the street who had tried to trap her and failed. And the trap had failed not because fate intervened, but because she had paid attention and acted. And then Eli had asked a question on a Wednesday when he came in for nails and rope. She nodded at Voss when she passed him, and that was all there was of it, which was exactly as much as it deserved. She told Eli once, sitting on the porch in the summer evening of 1882 with James asleep inside and the stars coming out over the Kansas plains, that she thought about the timing of that Wednesday sometimes, the specific coincidence of it, Eli's errand and her departure landing on the same morning. "If you had come on Thursday, I would have been gone," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I came on Wednesday because the harness on the south paddock fence had been worn through," he said. "I had been meaning to come for a week and kept putting it off." He paused. "If I had not put it off, I would have come the week before, and none of it would have meant anything." She looked at him in the summer dark. "Does that worry you?" she said. "No," he said, "because it happened. All the ways it could have gone differently are just the road not taken. This is the road," he looked at her, "and I would not trade this road for any other." She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat in the particular silence that belongs to two people who have built something real together and know it, and the stars continued their large and indifferent progress above the Kansas plains. Their second child was born in the spring of 1884, a daughter this time, with Eli's dark hair and Louisa's green eyes, who arrived in April with considerably more speed than her brother had, and who announced herself with a volume suggesting she already had strong opinions about the world. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, but because the name felt right, the way names sometimes do when you hold a new person and listen for what they are. James, who was 3, regarded his sister with a mixture of suspicion and possessive pride that seemed accurate to Louisa as a characterization of how he would likely continue to regard her for many years. The house had grown by then, 2 more rooms added in 1883, a proper parlor with bookshelves that Eli had built himself, measured and fitted with the same quiet care he brought to everything. The bookshelves had become one of her favorite things about the house, not because of what they held, though she loved what they held, but because of what they represented, which was Eli building a thing she loved because she loved it, without making it a bargain. She had a shelf for the geology book that had started everything, the one she had found in Wichita in the fall of 1878, and beside it the letters he had written her in those 6 months before he came to see her, tied with a piece of ribbon that had once been around a package of goods. She kept the letters because they were the shape of what had formed between them, the evidence of the thing that was not a performance. She had built the life she had described by a fire in the Danner Ranch on a cold October evening, not in exactly the terms she had imagined it, because life is more interesting and more complicated and more rewarding than the version of it you can imagine when you are sitting in a room you need to escape. She had a place. It was hers. She argued about ideas and read her books, and saw what the country looked like past the Kansas plains, when she and Eli took the train to Kansas City in 1883 for a week, their first real journey, and she had stood at the window of their hotel room looking at the city, and felt the particular pleasure of someone who has earned the view. In the fall of 1885, Pete Holbrook, who had been with them for 4 years and had become in that time something between employee and family, told them he was thinking of his own place, that he had saved enough for a start, and asked Eli if he knew any land. Eli spent 3 weekends riding with him and looking, and they found a piece south of the Danner Ranch that was right, and the day Pete put down his money on it was a day that felt, in the particular way of the frontier, like a continuation of something, the passing forward of the specific knowledge that it was possible to build something real. On their 6th anniversary in November of 1885, Eli brought her to the first place they had stood together on their land, the slope above the creek with the cottonwoods to the east, and he had asked her then, standing in the same place she had stood when she said yes to the whole of it, what she wanted for the next 6 years, because he believed in asking. She looked out over the land and thought about it seriously because the question deserved seriousness. The operation was solid. The children were healthy. The house was warm and full of books. She was doing work she chose for reasons she chose, and her name was on the accounts and the deed and the correspondence and everywhere else that mattered. "More of this," she said. "Exactly more of this," he smiled. "Then that is what we will build," he said. She turned and faced him on the autumn slope the way she had faced him the first time, and she felt what she had felt then, the settlement of something coming to rest, the particular rightness of two people who had each been trying to become what they decided to be and had found in the process someone to become it with. She kissed him on the November slope above the creek, with the cottonwoods going gold and the sky enormous and blue above the Kansas plains, and it was real and whole and entirely hers, nothing assumed, nothing taken, nothing that anyone had decided for her without asking. It was everything she had chosen, with her eyes open and her hands steady and her life free in the particular way that only people who have experienced the alternative truly understand. James Carson found them there when he came running over the ridge with his 3-year-old sister trying to keep up behind him, and General's replacement, a large and affectionate dog named Captain, who ran circles around both of them and seemed to regard the whole of the frontier as his personal territory. And the family came together on the slope with the autumn around them, and the land that was theirs in every direction, and the whole of a real life running forward into the years ahead. Open and chosen and built from the ground up, the accounts were balanced, the letters were kept, the bookshelves were full. And in the large, indifferent, vivid expanse of the Kansas frontier, two people who had each been trying to become what they decided to be had built, on the foundation of a single honest question, something that would last.